Grüß, willkommen in einem aufregenden Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 38 of my figure gaming video series. In this video, I'll discuss methods to speed up the setting up process of a game. One of the issues, possibly a main issue with figure gaming, is the time required to set up a game. If you turn up at a club and wish to fit 2 games in a day, or to comfortably fit a single game within a day, the last thing you wish to do is to spend an hour or more setting up. The pack-up time is also a factor to consider. However, you can also quickly just pack up your figures as quickly as possible in any manner that you wish, and then following day reorganize the figures, terrain and rules in their correct position. So while this is an issue, it's not as significant as the setup time. It obviously goes without saying that games can be set up for several days at someone's home does not really have this issue. In this case, if the setup takes several days, then, well, it's not an issue. You just simply spend the days to set up before the gamers turn up, so that when the gamers turn up, they can get stuck in gaming ASAP. However, even for games which are held at someone's home, if the game cannot be left for several days or set up prior to the game, the setup time can still be a factor. I've often have games in my garage, but this requires me to wake up nice and early so I can set up everything before 9 AM. This is not a major issue, but reducing this time is always a positive. In order to solve this issue, let's look at some of the areas that we can look at. The first factor is purely physical, getting the tables, unfolding them and arranging them as you require. I tend to prefer 3 standard sized fold-out tables, 2 for the playing area and 1 for all the other stuff required for a game. If playing at a club, you need to use whatever is available. However, when playing at home, I found a number of useful folding tables which may be of interest to people. A folding table of this type can be easy to store and easy to set up. I have 3 tables similar to this, 2 of which are always folded up until I need them, and the third I leave set up. I normally paint on that. These tables are normally about 70 to 80 centimetres deep and 180 centimetre long. You can get bigger tables, but I find the additional weight an issue, and I would not be able to pack them into the boot of my rather old Audi sedan if I did purchase that. These tables, I can get 2 of them in my boot. Depending on how large the playing area I require, I normally deploy my tables in this manner for a large game. The table on the side contains my boxes of figures, terrain, rules, charts and tables. The 2 tables on the left is used for the playing area. This gives me an area of 180 centimetres by 160 centimetres. If you need a larger playing area, the tables can be arranged in this manner. This gives me an area of 1.8 metres by 2.4 metres, which is probably about the most practical, largest size playing area you should consider, particularly if you only have 2 players. As a final point, I normally use a solid playing area for my games, basically a large MDF sheet with an edge on it, and as a result I normally use just this arrangement. In this case the playing area is only 80 centimetres deep, but I can place a 3x4 foot MDF sheet on this to act as my playing area, and that gets me what I need. There are many different types of arrangements players can adopt depending on the games that you wish to play, the rules, etc. You'll also obviously need chairs, and a simple folding chair of this nature is also easy to store and easy to deploy. I tend to find setting up the tables and chairs take no more than 5 to 15 minutes depending on how hurried I am. Incidentally, the chair that you see here is a metal frame chair, and one thing I've noticed as I've got older, while I haven't particularly gained too much weight, most of my gaming comrades have, so make sure the chair that you select is quite sturdy. While I typically use a MDF sheet as my playing area, I will typically cover the playing areas and even side tables, that's the tables which we've talked about already, with green felt. I do this to ensure my MDF playing area stays solidly on the playing area and will not slip. Players who use felt as their playing area would do this normally because they're playing on the felt. I also like placing green felt on the table as it looks and feels rather nice. However, that's just an esoteric thing and it's not really required. Once I've placed the felt on the tables, I then place the MDF playing area on top of it, either a single sheet or multiple sheet which I join together, or even cork tiles. I normally use 2 2x3 foot 3mm thick MDF sheets, which have been covered with woodland fine turf. The main reason I do this is that it makes setup time very quick, as looking reasonably good. There are many different types of playing areas. One option is a pre-printed player mat as a playing area. That works quite well indeed. In the example that you see here, I use 30cm square cork tiles, which I personally feel is not as good. It does not look as good, as well as taking a little bit more time to set up than I would particularly prefer. I've covered playing areas and terrain in many of my other previous videos, but one critical factor is how quickly can you set up a playing area. Whatever solution you select, make sure you consider setup time. The other factor to consider is terrain. Terrain can be rules dependent, so I can only provide some general guidelines, but one guideline is to ensure it can be easily and quickly deployed. In this case, I have standard terrain sizes for hills and wood, which I can quickly place as I wish. The roads and streams are embedded, so they require no setup time. Finally, the built-up area also uses a standard size, and I can quickly deploy them as required. Although how you deploy them can be a different issue to deal with, which I'm not going to cover in this video. While I have to admit this does depend on the rules, one useful way of speeding up setup is to use pre-deployed terrain. A player can quickly create a playing area, and then the opposing player can select the side they wish to play from. Historical scenarios tend to also be very good in this case, as the playing area is defined in the scenario details. However, if the terrain is complex, this can still be time-consuming to deploy. So you always need to ensure some level of balance is maintained. Now we come to what really is the biggest issue, the force mix. If playing a historical scenario with predefined forces, the force mixes can be arranged the day before a game. This can allow for very quick setup times. If playing an ad hoc game, this can be much more difficult. If using army lists, each player can build out their force mix the day before a game. This is a common system for Ancient's DBMM, for example. However, the real issue is that when you have an ad hoc game which has a variable force mix arrival schedule, or if the game is truly ad hoc, which means no one has prepared anything the day before, you do actually experience severe setup time issues when you bring out your force mixes. Let's see if we can solve some of these issues. Let's first look at a truly ad hoc game, which are games which have no prior preparation. This could be gamers deciding to try a game at a club on a whim. This type of game is not common with figure gamers, but if your rules allow you to have a game within a 2 to 3 hour period, it's certainly something which could definitely occur. Skirmish rules are a classic example of that. Once we move away from skirmish rules and move to a more traditional type of figure gaming, DBA or DBN are very good examples of such rules. In this case, this becomes viable because the army lists are very simple. Each player gets 12 points and an army list which provides only minimal variability. Two players can quickly select an army and create an army list within 10 minutes. Flames of War may also apply, although these rules achieve this with the use of an extensive range of scenario books. But, as a rule, these rules do not support games with variable reinforcements in the whole, or in the most part. Let's now look at variable force mix arrivals that you may wish to have in a game. This normally does not impact ancient games, but many Napoleonics, World War II and Cold War scenarios will often have variable forces come in at different times. Thus, the figures required for a game may not be known during the prior day. I have to admit this issue is only really a major issue if you're using something similar to an ad hoc card-based system, where players randomly select cards before the game, or even if they don't randomly, they just build their force mix just before the game and deploy them in a variety of different ways, which makes it very difficult for them to pre-organize their force mix. Or maybe that's not the case if you don't have a random selection process. However, if using a card-based system, the problem is generally resolved as the forces to be used are printed on the card. A player only needs to remove the required elements from whatever storage solution the player is currently using. So, if you have a set of cards which you're going to use to build up a force mix, even before the game, you can basically decide what kind of force mix you intend to deploy, and take the figures out into a second box or a special travel box which you'll be using for your game. However, if you're not using a card-based system where all the force mixes are printed on cards, so effectively become kind of like army list, if the variable force mixes and force mix arrivals were based on simple points only, which would then need to be allocated the figures against the figures, then there may be an issue. Thus, in this case, a player randomly or in a variable manner decides to deploy 100 points at the start, with 50 points and 75 points coming at different points of the game. This type of system would dramatically increase the time to set up, as both players would need to start converting points to figures. Thus, it may not be a good idea. If it's simple enough, it would work. Thus, in conclusion, to ensure rapid setup, you have to really focus on the fact that each player has a simple and clear way of determining what force mixes they are going to deploy, either before the game, ideally, or alternatively in a very quick manner in the morning before the game. This requires this information being printed on cards or scenario sheets or in a book. Where there may be lots of different options, some of which I've not considered in this video yet, then the player needs to be able to quickly reference something which allows them to quickly deploy their forces in order to have an ad hoc game. Thus, all the options should be clearly written on a piece of paper or some mechanism. The first classic example is a scenario. This is one for the Age of Eagles sets of rules. This provides full details of start forces, reinforcements, and the playing area. If using a card-based system, then whether or not you select the cards randomly or you actually look at all the cards and build up your force mixes based on points, then the details or all the details required for the force mixes should be detailed on the card. Players should not be expected to create their forces using a point system just before the game unless the system is as simple as DBA, DBN. There needs to be a quick way for players to basically create their force mix using a more complex point system, and a card, table, cheat sheet system is what you need to prepare before the game. If you're using a comparatively complex points-based system such as DBMM, players need a standard set of armies at various points of totals. In this case, we have a 200-point force mix, which players can use to play a game with a Kadesh flavor if they wish. In this case, the point system is pure DBMM, but the rules that I use in this case is P17CW, which is why the cards contain values which are not used in DBMM. One advantage of something like this, let's say you have a whole bunch of cards which different force mixes in a box you can select, is there's no reason why you can't say, ooh, I'd like to change the javelin with something else worth that number of points accordingly. So some minimal modification is required. But nonetheless, cards of this nature allow two random people at a club that meet and decide they want to, let's say, the Battle of Kadesh, to quickly whip out their forces and have a game. Now, what I showed previous was 200-point systems. You could have on the reverse 300 points. Now, what I use these days is I typically have a 200-point and a 400-point system because that tends to fit best with DBMM and also tends to fit best with P17CW. I've created these army lists in the form of large cards, and I possess a large number of different pairings of forces, so this allows me to quickly create a game, assuming I brought my figures with me. I have to admit I don't use the cards so much anymore. These days I simply just print it on a simple black and white A4 sheet of paper, because you don't need this in a card format. You just need a piece of paper next to you which allows you to understand exactly what forces you need to bring out and deploy, and all the necessary numbers that allow you to have a game without you being forced to do any kind of calculation. Now we come down to another factor you need to consider, and that is how you store your figures. Each player has their own system, but whatever system you use, it's important you can quickly find the correct figures from your storage solution. This will allow you to quickly place the required elements on a playing area. These are just some of the ideas which players should consider in order to allow them to set up a game quickly. Quick games are common in the world of board gaming, but are not so common for figure gaming. If the rules support quick games, players should do everything they can to ensure the setup time period does not negate the benefit of a quick play set of rules. And so we come to an end of episode 38 of my figure gaming hobby series, in this case analysing methods to speed up the setup process of any game. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.